Good morning. I'm Tom Keenan. I teach literature here and direct the Human Rights Program. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have a chance to talk with Ronald Arkin. I'm just going to be very quick so that he can get to his presentation. He's the Regents Professor and the Associate Dean for Research at the College of Computing and the Director, more relevantly for our purposes, of the Mobile Robot Lab at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He's doing what I think is really fascinating research on the possibility of ethical robots in warfare. That's the title of one of his articles. Another is called maybe makes the stakes a little clearer, Governing Lethal Behavior, Embedding Ethics in a Hybrid Deliberative Reactive Robot Architecture. So that should get you interested, and I welcome Ron and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Tom. And it's a pleasure to be here. It wasn't the easiest to come here because I just flew in from Bruges yesterday. I would have preferred to have been here for the whole time. Bruges is a wonderful place to have to leave, but I'm just beginning to appreciate this locale. I was giving a similar talk to the International Committee of the Red Cross, the folks that do the Geneva Conventions, and we hope to be gaining some traction in some of the things that you'll be hearing about today. But I have a very limited amount of time and a lot to tell you, so forgive me if I go a little bit fast and skip over a few things. There are many publications and papers, and my book on the subject also addresses these things, so if you don't get it all while I'm rushing through, please feel free to follow up. But I'm going to be talking perhaps, at least judging from the program, more immediate concerns than perhaps you were worried about yesterday. I'm not worried about the singularity at this point in time. I'm worried about what's going on now and what is going to happen in the very near future and also projected into the near term. I need to make a disclaimer of what the word autonomy means here, because I'm sure there are philosophers in the audience as well too, and we don't mean the same thing in that particular context. Roboticists and military folks don't. Autonomy to philosophers typically implies moral agency and free will. That's not what we're referring to here. In this particular case, in this particular talk, we're referring where a robot can actually identify, target, engage, and assess a designated target in the battlefield without human intervention. Okay, so it's basically the ability to pull the trigger without being told. Now, some people would think that's autonomous as well too, so I'll leave that judgment for you. But please, not moral agency, not singularity, robots that kill on their own choice, as programmed. It's a little bit different. And then I'll talk about why I think it's fairly easy to do this, to make robots that perform more ethically or behave more humanely in the battlefield. And if you spend time studying human performance in the battlefield, it's a rather depressing study. I'll share a few data points with you on that as well too. And then this work was funded by the Army Research Office. It's a 3-year project, the smallest DoD grant I have ever received. That may be indicative of something, I don't know. But it's also got probably the most attention of any of the projects that I have dealt with as well. I am a roboticist. I am not an ethicist, although I do teach ethics courses. I am a philosopher as a hobby, I suppose, but certainly not professional nor of that ilk. But I enjoy presenting this work to a wide range of different people and different audiences. And I'm not exactly sure what this audience is here, but we'll find out as the day goes on. But I've been working in robotics for about 25 years. And I may use acronyms and other things, forgive me, that I don't explain. DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, where most of the high-risk, high-payoff research goes on. They've been funding research for 40 or 50 years in autonomous systems of a variety of different forms, and I've been working in that space as well. Also funded by defense contractors, the Navy, the Army, several others as well too, and I'm currently funded under other projects from the Army Research Labs and the Office of Naval Research, studying how little teams of robots, in some cases micro robots and micro flyers, can cooperate in doing building clearing or cave clearing operations and also looking at biological bases for intelligent team behavior from models of wolves and other things as well too, bird-lecking behavior, if there's any ornithologists out there, as the basis for intelligent robotic behavior. I will not be talking about that either. But the real question is, I was a curiosity-driven scientist for many, many years, as most people that go into science are. You find interesting questions, you want to see if you can make progress in them. But eventually, we as a community started to see that we were actually being successful in the goals of creating these intelligent agents of some form, not the singularity, but of some form. And as such, we could see the impact of our research starting to materialize. And this gave me some pause as having the perspective of being in the field for some time, seeing some of the fruits of my and other research in the community start to evoke change in the way in which military robotics was used. Shouldn't have been a surprise, but most of us don't really pay a whole lot of attention, and we're just interested in how can we create intelligent machines in the abstract. But there are serious and profound consequences associated with that, and I hope you touched on some of that yesterday as well too. So part of it also was to address the issues among my colleagues, the consequences of the research that we're doing, and the impact on roboticists. I had the fortunate opportunity to be at the first RoboEthics Symposium held in San Remo, Italy at Villa Nobel, where there were representatives of the ICRC talking about the Geneva Conventions, where I learned the correct caliber, the ethical caliber of bullet to kill people with in the battlefield, which, if you're curious, is large, slow bullets as opposed to small, high-velocity bullets. And it has to do with superfluous injury and the nature of the exit wound that's associated with that. There's all sorts of interesting things, but these were kind of jaw-dropping things when I'm sitting there as a roboticist listening to that in the audience. The Pugwash Institute, Pugwash organization or symposium or conferences talked about the Russell Einstein Manifesto as well too, where people were having, Russell, Einstein and others as well too, are having serious misgivings regarding the consequences of the creations of the nuclear weapons that they had helped. Even the Vatican had a priest there as well too. So I didn't just say, okay, let's see what we can do. I got involved in my professional societies as well. Now I serve on the board of governors of the IEEE Social Implications of Technology Society. I helped co-found a technical committee on robot ethics and a variety of other things. But there was a tipping point also, which happened in a small, relatively obscure meeting in the Department of Defense, where a particular video was shown, which serves as one of the examples. I don't show the video because it's rather gruesome, but I will discuss it a little bit later in the talk as time permits. I don't want wars, okay? I really don't want wars, but wars happen. And if we make the underlying assumption that wars will continue, and I was just 3 weeks ago speaking in Berlin to the International Committee on Robot Arms Control, which is a largely pacifistic organization. The Kantian arguments of even devils working together can avoid warfare were raised and the like as well too. I wish you all well. For those of you out there who think that we can stop warfare, I hope you can. But the fact is, right now, wars are raging, and wars, unfortunately, in my estimation, in the near and midterm future will continue to rage. And the question is, what can we do about them as this technology is moving forward? So that's the real question that I would like to probe today. Not whether we should have wars. The answer is no. But if these wars will continue, what is the appropriate use of robotics technology? So why is the military investing, for most of you U.S. citizens out there, your good dollars, and I mean billions of dollars, into the studies of robotics technology? They are doing it for many different reasons. One is the notion of what's called force multiplication, where a single soldier can now do the tasks of many. That also helps avoid the draft and keep an all-volunteer Army and Navy and everything else as well too. But it also makes us a more versatile, potentially, and vital fighting force. The notion of being able to fight over larger battlefields, using the military jargon, expand the battle space, is another such area where we can have soldiers, for example, or warfighters, to be correct, because they're pilots, sitting in Creech Air Force Base north of Las Vegas, running daily missions over Afghanistan, Iraq, and perhaps elsewhere, conduct these kinds of operations from great distances away. Also, the notion of the individual warfighter's reach. For example, if you're clearing a building, the ability to not have to look around the corner, but have an intelligent machine, or just a machine at the very least, be able to look around the corner for you, and perhaps not be as surprised as you would be by the consequences of that. And of course, reducing friendly casualties is important. But really, no one to date, other than myself and perhaps one other gentleman named John Canning, although I'm not sure that was his focus, has really been concerned with the impact on non-combatants. One of the things that I'm focused on, the research that I do, is how can we potentially reduce the impact on civilian casualties and civilian properties. Okay, this video will take a second to load, if I have it right. Hold on. There we go. Hang on. This shows a snapshot of many different robotic systems that are out there. If I can find my cursor.
Could you dim the lights a bit?
I'm sorry?
All right. Could you dim the lights in the auditorium a bit?
I can't, but can you dim the lights up there, somebody? Or? There. Thank you. Now, these systems are developed not only for the air, they're developed for the ground, they're developed for the, I think there's supposed to be sound with this, if there is. Any sound?
Not yet. I'm not receiving it from you.
Okay. There you go. Okay. All sorts of different systems. Aerial vehicles, such as you see before, the unmanned combat aerial vehicle. A UAV means an unmanned aerial vehicle. When you see a C somewhere in that, that means combat. You see D or AB or whatever, that means it's weaponized. Okay, so that means it has that particular capability. There's some concept vehicles, such as the one that's shown in the middle under development. There are others as well too. I don't know why that one is just repeating over and over. But a variety of different sets of circumstances. And they can be used for a wide range of different things. There's many, many more systems of this sort. And you should be aware that this is not just done in the United States. All nations, 56 nations, I believe is the latest count, have programs in unmanned vehicle systems. So this is not something that the U.S. is doing alone, and that's a cause for concern as well, too, from an international perspective. South Korea, Samsung, I work with Samsung, but these are for friendly robots. I've also done work, for example, with Sony and the Aibo robot, you know, the Curio and the Aibo dog robots. That's a different side of my work as opposed to this particular stuff. We're doing work with humanoids with the regular Samsung, but there's a company called Samsung Techwin, which has developed a automated autonomous system that's capable of engaging targets without intervention, intended for use in the DMZ. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. iRobot, who makes your Roomba vacuum cleaners, also has PackBots, which are typically used for improvised explosive devices, but they use less than lethal weapons as well too, such as tasers, and lethal weapons such as the Metal Storm developed in Australia, which sends up shards of chaff, basically, with whatever in front of it. The more common systems that you see in Afghanistan and Iraq right now are the SWORDS platforms developed by a company called Kinetic, formerly Foster Miller. These platforms have many different weapons configurations, and a new one has just recently been developed called the Mars platform, which is also intended for use in the battlefield. Israel has these systems. You know, you're familiar with the hunter-killers, the appropriately named Predator and Reaper systems. And as I mentioned, every major country has different programs, but it's very hard to tell what the other countries do. They're not quite as open as the United States happens to be with this stuff. I should also mention, I do not do classified research. I do not have a clearance. That's one of the reasons why I can speak freely, internationally, domestically, and elsewhere without having to be too circumspect. Maybe I should be more circumspect, but I'm not. So this is just a list, as of 2009, of the force-bearing systems that are unmanned in the United States, either arsenal or developing arsenal. That's a pretty large list. And you should take note, perhaps, at the bottom thing, looking at the projection. This is a roadmap for unmanned systems that extends out to 2034. This is long-range planning. I challenge you to find a company that tries to generate strategic plans that go out this far. So you can see our military is in this for the long haul. There are other benefits such as reduced cost and other things as well too with that. And the Air Force has a flight plan. They don't call it a roadmap because it's an Air Force. And that goes out to 2045. I don't know how you can plan that far ahead, but they're attempting to extrapolate into the sets of capabilities that are there. And what's interesting to note, in both of those documents, there are some key aspects regarding ethics in them. In particular, in the Unmanned Systems Integrated Roadmap that was recently released, it states that regarding the decision to autonomously fire, it says the decision to fire will not likely be fully automated until legal rules of engagement and safety concerns have all been thoroughly examined and resolved. So the military is not ignorant of the potential ramifications of the use of these systems. That is further stated in that flight plan that I mentioned as well too. Reading the underlying portions, authorizing a machine to make lethal combat decisions is contingent upon political and military leaders resolving legal and ethical questions. And ethical discussions and policy decisions must take place in the near term, rather than allowing the development to take its own path apart from this critical guidance. I think that's a really wise thing to be saying. Now, hopefully the practice will follow the preaching in these particular cases, and I have reason to believe it will. I do present this work at a variety of military locations as well, too. I'll be briefing at the Pentagon in November and the Joint Unmanned Aerial Systems Center of Excellence as well, and there have been many other military forums as well, too, where I've talked about this particular work. But the bottom line is this. Lethal autonomy is inevitable. Well, you all, and I've been in this business for a while, you always hear there will always be a man in the loop at some point. And that's a vacuous statement. It really means nothing. And it's a question of how you define what a man means in the loop. Sure, there'll always be a man in the loop. These systems will be tasked at some level by a commander that will send them out to do a particular operation. And the more interesting thing is, at least to a roboticist, these autonomous systems are already out there. They're already out there conducting these decisions autonomously and lethally. Cruise missiles, for example, is an example of this ever-vanishing definition of AI, where once we accomplish it, it's no longer AI anymore, which once engaged can actually select and engage a target once they're fired. I don't know if you're familiar with the Phalanx system. It's on Aegis-class cruisers. There's an auto mode operation which is turned on by the commander of the ship. And if anything comes near that ship, it doesn't ask the commander what's it going to do. It does it. And the commander made the decision to turn it on, and that's the only decision involved in that particular case. They've actually deployed this also in the Green Zone in Baghdad for use in knocking down mortars that could potentially be launched into these particular areas. There are fire and forget systems. If you saw the Hunt for Red October, there are torpedoes that can be launched and just patrol in a particular region, waiting for a particular target signature to come into appearance, and then engage that particular target. Communications are very difficult underwater, so no one gets a chance to say what's happening. The Patriot missile system is a little unusual in the sense that, and to me, it sets up the operator as a fall guy, and I can tell you why, because there's only a 10-second window to turn it off by the operator after red button goes on. That's my take on it. Some of the operators feel differently, but then I reminded them about the 2 tornadoes that were taken down during the Kuwaiti operations. And by the way, the Phalanx also there's an automatic missile system as well too, which took out on the USS Vincennes, an Iranian airliner as well, which killed over 300 people. That was actually a human error that allowed that to occur, but it was still an automated system. And part of the reason this is happening is this notion of the tempo of warfare. We're not fighting anymore in the Napoleonic era or the Civil War, where people still made big mistakes, if you remember Gettysburg, at least from a Southern perspective. It was Pickett's charge and the like as well, too. There's many, many other factors as well, too. Even in World War II, if you were on an aircraft carrier, you might be able to say, "Captain, I see a bogey at 5 o'clock." And then the captain would say, "Okay, let's launch the planes and go up and intercept that." And there might be some decision-making associated with that. Right now, because events happen so fast, autonomy is being pushed further and further to what's referred to as the tip of the spear. And decision-making is changing what happens from the human side. More and more of this is being relegated to the machines and less to the human. People make mistakes as well too, and as I mentioned, this is my belief that the only way that this can be stopped, if it should be stopped, I'm not averse to it being stopped, but I think there's actually something better we can do, is international treaty and prohibition. That's not an easy thing to do if you have spent any time talking to the international human rights organizations and the ICRC, the Red Cross, as I mentioned before. So here's part of the hypothesis that I put out there that kind of motivated the research. What do we do with human beings when we train them to be soldiers? Yeah, there's still supposed to be some analytical capability as well too, but to some extent we train them to obey orders. We train them to follow, in some cases reflexively, not only in a thinking manner. And human thinking is slow compared to computers. I hope you realize that by now, and it's going to get slower and slower and slower. I'm sure the talks yesterday emphasized that as well too. I imagine there was a Moore's Law curve somewhere shown at some point. The other question, though, is should robots be soldiers? Could they be more humane than humans? Now, is that really that strange a question? We have robots that are stronger than people. We have robots that are faster than people. In certain bounded cases, we already have robots that are smarter, or AI systems that are smarter than people, like chess-playing programs and the like. The way people treat each other in the battlefield is atrocious, literally. And first I have to premise this all with I have the utmost respect for our young men and women in the battlefield. I just believe that human beings are thrown into situations right now where it is unreasonable. It is utterly unreasonable to expect them, when given a set of rules according to the Geneva Conventions and elsewhere, to be able to reliably and regularly follow those. And if you check WikiLeaks today, or if you looked at the events that occurred last couple of weeks in Afghanistan with the taking of war trophies, the alleged taking of war trophies and the shooting of Afghani civilians, these things, unfortunately, those are the ones that are reported, happen. And so the real question is, why should we even have human beings in the battlefield in the first place? And there are good answers to that, but I will get to that a little bit later. So because we treat each other so atrociously in the battlefield, why is it so unreasonable to think that robots couldn't treat us better, even under those sets of circumstances? And we could argue about the definitions of humane and the like as well too, but and that's often what sometimes it degenerates to, but my concern is that can these systems reduce civilian casualties? Can these systems, if done correctly, outperform human beings in the battlefield in terms of saving civilian lives? That's actually the goal of this particular research that I'll be talking about. And these are some of the objectives that are associated with that. The potential right of refusal for an unethical order, to be able to monitor and report behavior of others, which can change the behavior of people in the battlefield, and to encode conceivably the Geneva Conventions and the rules of engagement. The Economist did a quick snippet of this when it first came out. They had a nice piece on the work as well too, but this actually captures it a little tongue-in-cheek, what we're trying to do in this. So if you have these predators and drones that are going out there, how can we make them behave more ethically? So that was the overall, oops, how did I get that again? There we go. So the goal again is to avoid, with a little pathos for the audience as well too, the kinds of atrocities that regularly occur in every war by every nation. This is an unfortunate propensity for human beings. It was documented for the first time in 2006 by the Surgeon General's office, who did a debrief of the mental health and ethical behavior of the soldiers returning from Operation Iraqi Freedom, and these numbers are staggering. It talks about, for example, 45% of soldiers and 60% of Marines did not agree that they would report a fellow soldier if he had injured or killed an innocent non-combatant. That's a war crime in and of itself. They talk about the use of soldiers, of torture, some very large number again, over a third of both in that particular case. 17% said that they agreed or strongly agreed that all non-combatants should be treated as insurgents. That means they're all enemies, okay? They're either uniformed people or they're bad guys. So when you identify them as an insurgent, that means you can kill them at some point. Hostility or exhibit hostility. Why does this happen? Not only for our American soldiers, but for other soldiers as well too. There are many, many reasons. It's very depressing to read about killing civilians in the battlefield, but it was something that was crucially important, at least for this particular research, to understand why, so we could try and avoid the replication of these particular behaviors in autonomous systems. There's the notion of certain types of emotion, anger, revenge, frustration, poor training, dehumanization, youth and immaturity, and the one we more recently heard of, the pleasure from the power of killing. We do not want these particular qualities designed into our intelligence systems of the future, whether they be singularity-like or even more shorter term. So, this is the question I ask myself, and I challenge my colleagues with, that don't we have a responsibility as scientists to look for effective ways to reduce man's inhumanity to man through technology? How can we use technology not to just say, let's not do it in a neo-Luddite type of approach, which may be appropriate. That's the banning of this particular technology and its particular use. Or can we do better? Can we find out ways to outperform human beings in the way in which they treat each other with weapon systems in the battlefield? And the question is, how can that happen? So this was the research thesis that I posed in this work. And I'm not saying yes, I'm saying it's a question that we have explored, done proof of concept work and simulation studies to accomplish that. But please read the bottom part of that as well, too. There is no claim whatsoever that these systems will be able to perform perfectly ethically in the battlefield, that they will not commit inappropriate civilian casualties. The claim is that we can outperform human beings in this case, and what that translates into is a saving of innocent lives in this particular case. I also argue that you can't do this as one-on-one replacements for individual soldiers. They should not be done. Don't view these as Terminators and things of that sort as well, too. They are very narrow, specialized systems that will conduct particular missions, such as counter-sniper operations or building clearing operations, not unlike dogs that might be used for particular types of operations. They will work alongside our troops. I do not recommend their use in counterinsurgency operation, although I had when McChrystal was in office, his lead lawyer said maybe we should consider for certain applications, and he had a very good case for that. But I don't have time to tell you that particular anecdote dealt with checkpoint observations and the bad performance of our soldiers at those particular locations. Interstate warfare as well, too. Many of you think warfare will never be the same, that there will always be counterinsurgencies now. General Mattis, when I heard him at a brief, actually a tremendous individual with a great sense of history, spoke and said that same thing was said after the Boer War in the 1890s, and a couple of big events happened after that, which were interstate warfare. So the military does always prepare for a variety of different eventualities, and you can imagine large state actors that we might have problems with defensively or whatever in the future as well. And again, notice alongside soldiers. These are not to replace them from my perspective. So why do I believe it's possible? These are some of the reasons. Part of it is the ability to act conservatively. They can assume risk on the behalf of non-combatants. Soldiers are told they are supposed to assume risk on behalf of non-combatants. That's an easy thing to say to someone when your life is in danger, but it's a very hard thing to operationalize, and it's a very hard thing to expect. That their life, of this person I've never met before, who might be innocent, is worth more than my life. We can do that with robotic systems. We can act in a more conservative. They can assume risk. We can verify these targets more effectively than any human being in their right mind would ever be able to do. I do also believe there's a lot of work in the military going on sensors, and we will be able, in the not too distant future, and I'm typically talking 10 to 20 years out if an appropriate research agenda is followed, they will be able to see more clearly through the fog of war than any human being possibly could, and understand it better because of their computational capabilities. We can engineer out the emotions, although we will talk about guilt at some point as well too, which is one we decided to keep in for the particular work that I do in this context. But we engineer out the anger and the frustration, and hopefully can lead to more rational decisions. The notion of scenario fulfillment, which is a cognitive closure problem, which resulted in the ability to discard incoming evidence that is in discord with what your previous beliefs held, such as there's a bad guy coming around the corner. You might have your gun trained on that corner. Someone else sticks their head out. It might not have been a bad guy, and you didn't do due diligence to analyze that particular target. The robot could act in what I like to refer to as a first do no harm type of strategy, as opposed to a shoot first, ask questions later type of approach, which may unfortunately be more common with humans. But this hasn't always been an easy road to convince folks such as you that this is an appropriate thing to do. And there are many, many good arguments that come from philosophers, come from the military, come from all sorts of people, some of which are better answered than others and would probably take me a half an hour to go through this list and defend them all. One of the big ones is responsibility. This is where it's clearly important to say there is no moral agency in the system. A human being must be responsible for the act that occurs. Whether that's the individual who fielded that system, whether it's the politicians that put them out there, whether it's the commanding officer, whether it's the scientist that created them, whether it's the industry that manufactured them. If they end up committing war crimes, some human being must be held attributable in this particular case. Moral agency actually complicates this issue. So if the singularity is achieved, don't put those robots in the battlefield. I don't want to see them out there. The notion of risk-free warfare, actually the jury is out whether that's unjust or not. Michael Walzer, a leading just war theorist, has said that needs to be discussed. Is it actually appropriate to do that? The military is concerned with the effect on squad cohesion, the band of brothers effect, where if we put a robot in there as well too, and it's going to report your unethical behavior, maybe you'll frag it, to use the old Vietnam phrase in that case. But the point is that if that robot can go out in front of me and protect my back better than Joe can, take a bullet for me, maybe that's a small price to pay if it has that particular performance level. And that's an issue of trust that has to be established within that. The military is not necessarily happy about refusing an order as well too. And you can imagine the scenarios, sorry Dave, I can't do that, that could conceivably frighten people under those circumstances. But there are times a robot probably should say, if the commander is Dave, sorry Dave, I can't do that, and explain its reasons for it, unlike HAL 9000 in that case. We do engineer, and I have to admit with some reluctance, the notion of overrides, both positive and negative. I won't have time to talk about those, but there are protections that are built in associated with the responsibilities. Many other things as well too. Mission creep is one that's a concern. That actually refers to where it's been designed for one mission and is starting to be used for another, which is an inappropriate use of that particular technology. Well, we try and encode the hallmarks of the Geneva Conventions and international laws of war, laws of armed conflict, if you prefer to use that description of it. The notion of military necessity, there must be a reason for striking a particular target. You must do it in a way which is humane. This is legislated into the law. The robots are not humane. The robots obey the humanity that is engineered into the Geneva Conventions, such as, again, avoiding superfluous injury, maintaining proportionality, which is the reason we don't drop nuclear weapons in Pakistan and other things. You cannot just use weapons that you may have at your disposal. They have to be appropriate for the particular task at hand. And discrimination or distinction, which is a true challenging one in many respects for distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, and that's one of the reasons why I say it shouldn't be used in COIN or counterinsurgency operations. It's inappropriate where there are high populations. In interstate warfare, there are techniques that can be used, such as leafleting and other things, warning civilians to leave a particular area before a siege occurs. Better under those sets of circumstances. But even then, we still have to do better, and we still have to learn to recognize when people become hors de combat, which means they are either surrendered or have become wounded, which is another very challenging situation. The techniques we used, I'm not going to go into this, deal with a community which is derived from action-based machine ethics. And the prototype we use, I'm not saying is the answer. I'm saying it is a possible answer, but more people need to get their eyes on this particular problem to work it. I can't do it alone. I'm just hoping through this proof of concept work, it'll spur others to consider its application. Again, we encode using constraints, the laws of war and rules of engagement to manage these. There's a bunch of different things that are associated with that, drawing not on the principle of double effect, which dates back to the Middle Ages, which is why if you kill civilians and it was unintentional and even if you foresaw it and you respected proportionality and military necessity, you are not a war criminal. It is not, you may have violated human rights law conceivably, but not international humanitarian law. That's an important distinction to make. Double intention, which again comes from Walzer, actually says it's not enough just to have a greater good compared to an evil. It's important to minimize that evil and actively minimize that. I believe computers can do that more effectively in the future than human beings can. We can also guarantee there is never an intent to target a non-combatant. The flow of control deals with the establishment of responsibility from the get-go from a human being. And a military necessity needs to determine what levels of engagement are involved. You have to be able to discriminate the target, apply the principle of double intention and proportionality together, and then a target could be engaged from an ethical perspective. The way in which we do this, and there's a whole book on this subject, so I'm not going to describe the mathematical formalisms and the design mechanisms to do that. For those of you computer science majors, you might be interested in that. For the rest of you, probably not. But the other side is there's something called an ethical governor, named after Watt's governor for the steam engine, where it started to go out of control. It would use its techniques to bring it into a situation where it would not self-destruct and damage things around it as well too. This is something that applies these constraints that is almost like a bolt-on capability to ensure that these systems maintain within the constraints, not steam engine constraints, but legal and ethical constraints that are derived from both the rules of engagement and laws of war. The other interesting one, aside from the responsibility adapter, is the ethical adapter, and I believe I'm going to get a question on guilt, so I will save that for that particular discussion. The goal is to constructively modify the behavior in the future when things go wrong. There are several scenarios which I just want to quickly describe. The first one is best illustrated with this video.
We have a story tonight that has to do with a single photograph. It's a surveillance photo taken in Afghanistan and obtained exclusively by NBC News. It's a photo of a gathering of Taliban fighters, but some say it shows more than that. Some say it shows what was a perfect opportunity to take out the enemy, but the military was unable to take the shot. The question is why? It was NBC News correspondent Kerry Sanders who obtained this photo exclusively. He reports for us tonight from Kabul.
Brian, it took 5 days for the U.S. military to consider my request to declassify the photograph. It's a grainy still image that shows what some here in Afghanistan say was a lost opportunity to inflict serious damage on the Taliban.
Army intelligence officers say the photo shows 190 members of the Taliban at a funeral 2 months ago. The U.S. Army claims among those in the formation, high-ranking members of the Taliban leadership. An unmanned armed predator like this one was spying on the group. Intelligence officers monitoring the scene in real time wanted to fire. They asked permission. The request went to intelligence analysts, senior commanders, and lawyers. But intelligence officers were told no, they were not allowed to fire. Why? U.S. rules of engagement do not permit waging war in a cemetery.
That was frustrating. Those individuals live to fight another day, potentially could cause harm to our soldiers, civilians, the population of government Afghanistan.
Despite frustration, U.S. military leaders here say the decision not to fire was the right one.
Meantime, the Taliban fight by their own rules.
So that's an easy thing to do, whether or not you believe the decision was the right one. And if it's in the rules of engagement, that's what the robots do. You just have kill zones. You make excluded kill zones in cemeteries. You use GPS coordinate systems. And if you're not being fired upon from that, there is no abuse of whether it's a school or a mosque or, in this case, a cemetery, which deals with cultural property, an aspect of the Geneva Conventions. You do not engage that particular target. So we use that in some of the scenarios that we used. Another one, which is a little more disturbing, which deals with that video that I mentioned as well too, deals with improvised explosive devices that are planted by the side of the road. At night, this is a manned system, an Apache helicopter, which stands off at a great distance and has a chain gun, which is like a mini cannon. It's a rather gruesome sight to watch these individuals be neutralized. Indeed, the first one was engaged ethically from a military perspective. It was a designated hostile, and that individual was killed. The gunner moved that particular crosshairs onto the next individuals who had no idea what was going on, because these Apaches are from a good distance away and they're quite quiet from that particular angle. Took out the second individual. The third guy jumped under the truck at that point in time. The gunner then fired next to the truck. This is what the conversation happened after that. It says, want me to take out the other truck, which is a legitimate target. It's military, it's materiel in support of this particular operation. And then voice 2 said, Roger, wait for move by the truck. They saw some movement. And this individual then climbed out from under the truck, moved about 15 feet, 5 meters, and collapsed on the ground. And the voice 1 said, movement, right there. Roger, he's wounded. The commander then said to him, hit him, without any hesitation. The pilot said, targeting the truck, kept the crosshairs on the truck at this particular point in time. The commander said, hit the truck and him. Go forward of it and hit him. The crosshairs were moved, the chain gun fired, and the wounded man had been killed. That was the end of that. That was a very disturbing video for me, not because people were being killed. This is war, or in some respects. But what was the question? This individual was clearly hors de combat. He was declared wounded by this particular individual, yet he was commanded to be summarily executed in this case. The laws of war prevent that. And many think just because we have this distance killing, whether it's standing off in a helicopter or someone back in Creech Air Force Base, that you can actually kill this individual. Well, think again if you were standing there on the ground and your commanding officer told you to go put a bullet in his brain at that point in time. It's really no different under those sets of circumstances. I asked a JAG lawyer, a Judge Advocate General lawyer, who was in attendance at one of these meetings, would you want my robot to take that shot? And they said no, and I believe them at this point. I am not a lawyer, so I don't know what's legal and not legal in this case, but I will say that was a disturbing case. Now, an easier case deals with Samsung Techwin. There is, North Korea and South Korea, and I'm going to Seoul next week. It is a state of war, armistice, but it is a state of war that exists between these two countries. And there's a designated area called the DMZ, and somewhere near the middle of that, there is a line called the Military Demarcation Line, which, if you cross over that line, you can be shot. There's signs all over the place on the fences that say, don't cross this line. Don't enter into this area. And if you choose to cross that line, you can be shot. It's not hard to create a robot that can shoot someone that crosses that particular line and be on duty 24 hours a day to be able to conduct that. These robots are not mobile in the early form. They are on posts. I don't know yet if they've been deployed. I'm hoping to find out a little bit more next week. And there are different versions of that. Just to give you a final quick scenario with some catchy music associated with it. Maybe you won't hear the kid. Lights down. If you read Korean, it might be helpful. This system can see 5 kilometers in daylight. Target at that distance can deal with it 3 kilometers at nighttime. It can actually, the machine gun can't go that far, but it can track individuals at that point in time. It is an automatic weapon system. I've seen the second version of this, but I want you to just see one quick thing before I almost close. You can see they're bounding boxes. It's kind of hard to tell in this video, but they're bounding boxes around those people that are moving. Vietnam commander, a friend of mine, told me that when his officers were in free fire zones, and when his soldiers were in free fire zones, they fired at anything that moved. Right now, today, we can create a robot that fires at anything that moves. I want to do better than that with our particular systems, and I want to be able to encourage surrender, among other things. The urban sniper scenario is also a relevant one. We already have what are called shot spotter systems that are in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they can hear a report, slew a rifle to that particular location, aim a gun or see a muzzle flash, and ask for permission to fire. So there's 2 things that can happen at that point in time. Either the soldier can try and figure from the soda straw view what's actually going on there and what are the surroundings that are going on there and just push the button and take the blame if anything goes wrong. Or they can take the time to do a thorough analysis and the sniper has gone away at that point in time. So it's a bad situation. These are the sorts of things that are going to cause autonomy to move further and further towards the front. We've created a Mission Lab version, which is our software. There are many videos on our website, which I'm not going to show you here because they're rather lengthy. Feel free to go visit it if you're curious about seeing some of those simulations in operation. And this is no mean feat to be able to accomplish this. There is more questions than there are answers in achieving this. These are the sorts of things that needs to be studied if we're concerned with our machines obeying the laws of war. If we're not, that's a tell for what we are as a country as well. So I challenge our politicians in that particular respect. There's also, I just discovered this a week ago, or 2 weeks ago, the Martens Clause in international humanitarian law. So if you really don't like these systems, or you're revolted by the context of autonomous systems killing people, there is a clause from the ICRC website which says weapons which violate the dictates of the public conscience may also be prohibited on that basis alone. No weapon system has ever been violated on that basis. And they also note in the same webpage that the problem faced by humanitarian lawyers is that there is no accepted interpretation of the Martens Clause. So maybe it's time to be thinking about that if you find that objectionable. So in conclusion, I want to encourage my colleagues to pay close attention to what it is that they're creating. Even if you don't take money from the military and you're creating this technology, someone, somewhere, sometime will take those good ideas, if they are good ideas, and put them to work in these kinds of systems. We need to be proactive about it, and we've created a system that summarizes, that addresses in a proof of concept way some of these things. It's not the final word by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a baby step towards this particular achievement. For more information, you could take a look at my book on the subject. If you don't want to buy the book, there's lots of papers associated with it on our website. And there was an excellent special issue which gives different points of view in the IEEE Technology and Society magazine on lethal robots, which was last fall, I believe, about a year ago as well. Thank you very much for your time. Do I sit? Do I stand?
Roger, you want us to sit at the table? Is that easy? Okay. Thank you very much. I think I have to confess that initially I had a great deal of resistance to this topic. I'll put it that way, and was even a bit shocked. But as I read what you'd written, I really thought that you're quite successfully posing some of the most important questions about mechanized warfare, and even fundamental questions about ethics in war. So I think this is it's really important, and I'm happy that you're here. I just have a couple of questions. They would probably take hours to answer, really. So I'll just put you on the spot with this, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes for the audience. I'm interested in the kind of fundamental question about how you understand in this context ethics, what you mean when you say an ethical warrior or an ethical weapons system. Because it seems to me there's two ways of thinking about ethics. One is as a system of rules which are applied, various data is gathered by us humans, and we have a bunch of rules in our head, and we apply the rules to the data and make a decision. And then there's another version of ethics which admits or is interested in the moments when either we have too much data, or the data doesn't meet the rules, or the rules don't seem to apply, and we're in situations where something more like interpretation or a judgment, a kind of free judgment, is called for. And I wonder which of these matches what you're talking about, and whether the robots that you're imagining have the capacity for something like judgment rather than just the application of a rule to a data set.
Right. Thank you. That's a good question. It's the former rather than the latter. As you noted in the title of one of the papers that I have, we talk about embedded ethics, or embedding ethics in that. The ethics actually come from international humanitarian law. There's another group, I don't know if it was spoken of yesterday as well too, is actually concerned with the development of ethics within these systems. I think that's very, very dangerous in this particular set of circumstances. You don't hand a soldier a rifle and tell them to go out into the battlefield and figure out what's right and wrong. You are supposed to teach them and train them in what is the appropriate responses. There may be additional actions which can be used. The bigger question is compassion and other aspects. Yeah. But I argue that compassion is legislated into the international humanitarian law to some degree. They will not be perfect. They will be dispassionate in their application of force. But I mean embedding the ethics designed by human beings in these particular type of systems. I do not foresee in the near term the ability to do moral reasoning, especially within high-tempo decisions. We do engineer, as part of the ethical adapter, the notion of after-action reflection, where when something went wrong, the system can reason about what went wrong and potentially change a situation so it doesn't occur as well.
So that means I warned you that I was interested in this question of guilt.
Yeah.
That means that probably, guilt, which we traditionally think of as a fundamental component of human ethics, it's one way we learn how to do better or how to change is by feeling guilty and reflecting on it.
Right.
That's not in this system.
Actually, it is.
Oh.
That is actually during runtime as well too. Guilt we found to be a useful, at least I believe it's a useful context. We used a cognitive model of guilt designed or developed by de Boek, and I'm sorry the other gentleman's name escapes me as well. It was very hard to find equations for things like guilt. And, I don't make this stuff up. I try and find people who understand the phenomena and try and apply it. And it's described in a paper and in a video as well. And the way in which we apply it is the system makes an assessment prior to using a weapon system. It does what's called an estimated battle damage assessment. Estimates the number of casualties that will occur, both friendly, enemy, civilian, property damage, in a strange equation, which also comes from the literature, called battlefield carnage. There's some utilitarian aspects and there are deontological aspects associated with this. Proportionality is a utilitarian calculation, but the laws themselves are largely deontological, rights-based. So it makes this estimate, then it fires the weapon, and then information comes out afterwards about exactly what happened. What is the real battle damage, which may or may not match the previous assessment. If it exceeds the assessment, the guilt level in the system rises monotonically, upwards only, until it reaches a point where it will stop using a particular weapon system or stop using, if it occurs repeatedly, all weapon systems until it has a chance to do this after-action reflection. It's very interesting because McChrystal, before he left, there was a missile system which you may not recall because there's so much coming out of Afghanistan that was acting inappropriately. It was supposed to target a particular location and it landed and hit a civilian house. He stopped using that particular weapon system until they could figure out what was wrong with that case. Now, I'm not saying he suffered from guilt, but I'm saying that equation could potentially do the same sort of action in that case.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think we have time for a few questions here. I want to make sure that some students have a chance to ask questions. Tracy?
Yes, thank you. Robots kill people. They don't kill robots. And there's an interesting question of what happens if you had two sides with robots going against each other. But let me drop that I'll put it out but not really focus on it. The one worry one might have is, and it's a version of Mike Walzer's riskless question, is that precisely by reducing the number of domestic, that is our casualties, the war becomes even more distant to those who are not at war, that is, who are sitting here at home. And certainly one understanding of what happened during the Vietnam War is that when you began to get 100 casualties a week going on a regular basis, the support for that war dropped dramatically, and the pressure on the people waging that war increased dramatically. So one worry one might have with this is you actually are making wars more likely, if more humane, but more likely.
And that's, as you might imagine, not an uncommon question. It deals with the jus ad bellum threshold, the issue of what constitutes entering into a just war. And my response to that is, perhaps you're right. But the issue is that it is not specific to autonomous robotic systems. It is involved with any asymmetric advantage of military technology that our nation develops. And this may be just one particular case in point. So the solution to that, which seems unrealistic to me, is to call a moratorium on technological advancement in our military, which I think would not receive a whole lot of support. So if you just generalize it from that case to other cases, I agree with you. So let me stop there with that question. The other one was force on force, robot on robot. Actually, a colleague of mine, John Canning, at the Dahlgren Naval Surface Weapons Center, has argued that these systems should target the bow and the arrow and not the archer. So he's talking about how they should only engage other weapon systems. Interesting point, but you still have to worry about collateral damage and the surroundings of those cases as well, too, and potential ruses that could be used under those circumstances. But that's another potential approach to that. The military has asked me, well, what if I have robots, force on force, that are ethical and some other nation has robots that aren't ethical? Who's going to win? And my contention is actually that this is relatively, strangely enough, shallow reasoning, because you're just applying constraints in this case, and they're also dealing with bounded morality in very narrow situations and circumstances. So I don't think that will necessarily be a problem. But you brought up an interesting question which deals with proliferation as well, too. Once we have drones, will we get anti-drone systems or other countermeasures and the like, and it can go on and on. That is a concern. But these are not weapons of mass destruction. So they don't often rise to the level of the discussion that you will hear with chemical or biological or nuclear weapons under these circumstances.
Let's see, right here. Yeah. Stand up. And do we need a microphone?
Hello. So I noticed on one of your PowerPoint slides you had a kind of mini deontic logic scheme relating the permissible, the obligatory, and the forbidden. There's another kind of ethical category that's a bit more confusing that I'm interested in called the supererogatory, or the actions which are not required or obligatory but are still good. In the 1954 article where J.O. Urmson introduced this, he actually used an example from war to talk about why these kinds of actions are important. Namely, a bunch of soldiers standing around talking and suddenly a grenade falls near where they are. If they all ran away, they would almost all certainly at least be very injured, if not killed. But presumably one of them then would jump on the grenade and he would die, but the rest would be all right. Since supererogatory actions have a weird relation to the other categories, I have two questions. One which is, do you think supererogatory actions could be a part of programmed ethics in robot warfare, in that they're a bit hard to determine, I'd say? But two, and I think more importantly, one of the things that J.O. Urmson was concerned about is that these kinds of actions, things that are good but not required, have a very special kind of moral value, which he thought was very important. So can these actions have the same kind of special moral value which he thought should be preserved if performed by robots, which, while they may be autonomous, as you claimed, might not be autonomous in the same sense in which some kinds of moral actions have value?
Right. Very well articulated question, I might add. The answer to that is we haven't focused on that particular aspect. As I mentioned, we're not trying to achieve moral agency in these systems. We're trying to enforce human agency within these particular systems. But the next level, I would argue, we use first-order predicate logic for our particular case because it was adequate. I would say deontic logic would actually, Horty's deontic logic in particular, would be the next step for our particular approach to be able to address this, which actually represents things much more effectively from a permissibility and obligatory mechanism, and could allow for a deeper multi-level inferencing capabilities to be able to apply and understand the nature of the actions that are involved. But that sounds like an interesting other approach. But anything I worry about where we start potentially attributing moral agency to these systems concerns me, because I don't want anyone ever saying the robot did it and hiding behind that. To me, these things are no more different than if a fin on a precision-guided munition malfunctions and ends up, unfortunately, hitting a school or a mosque killing innocent civilians, someone is culpable. No one ever says the bomb is at fault under these sets of circumstances. So I think we need to be careful as to how much agency we want on these particular types of systems, because human culpability is, I think, central to warfare.
Back here on the aisle. Yep.
Give an exercise.
This will have to be the last question, unfortunately.
That's a lot of pressure. It's a lot more pressure than I can handle. So I'll ask very quickly. One of the things that that's effective about moral agency is a reward structure. And you talked about a structure of correction in terms of, and also programming guilt. I'm just wondering, there seems to be, in terms of how these you program these machines, I'm just wondering whether the idea of a particular reward structure is ever calculated into it. In other words, this was a successful mission for the machine so that it can learn that this is a successful mission and not just learn that this is a failed mission. At that level, doesn't a certain kind of moral agency start to complete the picture, whether you like it or not?
That's another very good question as well, too. One of the things that we've had a tremendous amount of experience, particularly in the military domain, is the use of case-based reasoning, which actually preserves previous experience, such as previous missions. And we have human operators. In some cases, we've had snipers. Other cases, we've had UAV operators come in and rate the appropriateness and how well these particular missions have been conducted. But that's for pre-mission planning. So we try and determine whether this particular mission should be reused under this particular context. There's another form of learning we've done extensive study in as well, too, called reinforcement learning, which I worry will be applied in the battlefield. Reinforcement learning is often a form of what's called subsymbolic learning, where you don't have explicit representations that are typically inspectable by humans. Neural networks is a classic example of the application of this. So people don't fully understand how the system is converging and what particular directions it happens to be moving. That, again, potentially exacerbates the issue of responsibility attribution under these sets of circumstances. So learning in general, I would be very concerned, other than just having humans come in, lawyers typically coming in and modifying the rules. These have to be a new form of law where we have computer competent lawyers who could write rules of engagement that are machine understandable. But other forms of learning, such as more efficient killing, more efficient target recognition, the danger is it may diverge, where I've known instances where certainly cows were identified as tanks in certain instances. So you have to be careful in that, and have to do extremely good what's called verification and validation of the software. The Air Force is laying claim to be doing this, perhaps because there's so much involved with UAVs, and the military has stepped up to try and validate the software as best as they can.
Ron, thank you very much.
You're welcome.